a moonlit ring of mushrooms in a summer pasture, to some a quaint peculiarity of nature, to others the rim of a dance floor where daylight people might step a little too close and find themselves on the wrong side of time. If you grew up hearing that you shouldn't pick the mushrooms in a circle, or that the hawthorn by the lane was a place to pass with averted eyes, what you learned was not a child's superstition, but a thin, patient counsel against disturbing something older than any county map. That counsel, repeated in cottage parlours and on market days, kept alive an entire logic about how humans and certain non-human forces interacted, a logic that is less about glittering wings and more about bargains, boundaries and consequences. When I first set out to understand the word fairy, I expected a tidy species, tiny, winged, perhaps mischievous. Instead, I found a catch-all label that European vernaculars had applied to a bewildering range of beings. House spirits who helped with chores until offended by a gift. Lake women who married farmers and vanished when a taboo was broken. The ambiguous hosts who swept across moor and field, carrying off sleepers or leading travelers astray. Some of these figures could be kind. Many were beautiful, many were not. What tied them together was less a single nature than a set of recurring ideas, liminality, technical bargains, and the capacity to upend a human life by interpreting words or gestures in a way a human never intended. This is not the story of Tinkerbell alone. It is not the soft, sanitized fairy dust of Victorian picture books or Sunday school lullabies. The story I want to unfold is darker and more complex. It stretches across counties and islands, England, Wales, Ireland, Scotland, and through centuries from medieval chronicles that trembled with suspicion of the underworld to 19th century collectors who, even as they polished the tales for modern readers, preserved echoes of older, more dangerous imaginations. We will move through two useful archetypes to help organize what follows: the modern, tiny-winged sprite, and the courtly, human-sized fae, whose rules are as binding as statute law. Between those two poles lies a vast, mutable field of belief that shaped how people spoke to their land, how they named their losses, and sometimes how they punished those who were different. If this topic wakes up any local memory, maybe an old relative who warned you not to trim the rowan, or a childhood tale about a fairy tree, tell us in the comments where you grew up. Those local echoes are part of how these stories survive. For now, listen to one image: a woman at night at the bank of a lake, her reflection blurred, answering a question wrongly because she had crossed into a different contract of meaning. That kind of example repeats through the British Isles, in different guises and with different consequences. To begin, we must unlearn anachronism. The fairy, as a household name in English, comes into use relatively late. Anglo-Saxon England speaks more often of elves, and those are not always kindly. Medieval writers, clerics, and storytellers recorded encounters with underground realms, women who appear at the edge of a dance, and visitors who carry time with them like a heavy cloak. Gerald of Wales told tales that blend topography and terror. Chaucer and later poets preserved images of nocturnal revels and beautiful but dangerous companions. These medieval pieces do not present a single taxonomy. Instead, they offer motifs: the green-clad rider whose court is splendid and implacable, the dance that stretches through nights until a human is altered, the small household demon that helps with milking or spinning, but never accepts being paid too plainly. If you walk into the Victorian imagination, the picture begins to change. The 19th century, with its romantic sensibilities and a booming market for illustrated books, turned fairies into small, often winged figures suitable for children's plates and illustrated verse. Artists and writers reframed ancient motifs into things that could be boxed, captioned, and sold. That is not simply bad taste or simplification. It is a cultural reframing that fit modern domestic ideals. Yet it is also a veil. The Victorian fairy can obscure the earlier, often ambiguous and dangerous beings who occupy mounds, hedgerows, and waterways. When we speak of the dark side of fairies, we mean the persistence of older ideas, the courts, the bargains, the strictures about iron and salt, that the modern sprite image tends to eclipse. Medieval texts give us two crucial insights that survive in popular memory. First, fairies or analogous beings often exist in a parallel social world that mirrors human hierarchies. They have leaders and hosts, they hold feasts, they enforce rules. Second, contact with them is governed by precise transactions. A human might gain prosperity by entering a bargain with a fairy spouse, or might be punished for a single breach of etiquette. It is this brittleness, this literalism of obligation, that makes the folklore so dangerous when taken literally in social life. For centuries, communities used these stories to explain sudden illnesses, infant death, unexplained madness, or the uncanny presence of a child who seemed changed. The narrative may describe marvel, but behind the marvel are mourning families and the social need to account for tragedy. Across the British Isles, the landscape itself often supplies the theatre for these encounters. Mounds, ancient tumuli, barrows are frequent loci. Where a farmer sees an inconvenient hump in a field, local law might add a prohibition. Do not build over the mound. Do not remove the stones. Do not cut the hawthorn that crowns it. Lakes and rivers have their maidens. Hedgerows and fairy rings are places where the boundaries thin. Time is elastic in these zones. A dancer in a ring returns to find her fields run wild, or a lover who has slept one night in a fairy hall wakes to discover decades have passed. These motifs are not random superstitions, but a way of attending to places where human fabrics intersect with longer, older histories. Places where a community's memory feels the presence of something that was there before measurable history. Before we move deeper, a short taxonomy will help. I will call the tiny, sentimental image the sprite archetype. Small, winged, domesticated in literary imagination, largely a child-friendly invention of later centuries. The other archetype, which I will call the fey court, is human-sized or at least human-sized in demeanor. Structured, hierarchical, and governed by rules. The courtly fey interpret words in the way lawyers pass contracts. They reward exactness and punish technicalities. Between and around these archetypes tumble regionally specific beings. Pixies in the West Country, brownies in Hearthside lore, selkies on Atlantic coasts, kelpies on loch edges, pukas in Irish hollows, banshees who herald death, and various hosts who sweep through nights riding phantom horses. England's tales are a patchwork, rich in domestic detail and local colour. In the southwestern counties, pixies have a long life in oral tradition. They are often described as tricksters who lead travellers astray down muddy lanes, pixie-led roads that twist until a carriage is lost in unfamiliar fields. People developed practical countermeasures. To avoid being led off course, a trick recommended in several county collections was to reverse clothing or to recite certain phrases. Rowan trees were thought protective. Hanging rowan at a doorway or carrying a sprig could ward off misdirection. These remedies tell us as much about the social world as the creatures themselves. Communities needed protocols to manage the unpredictable. Another class of English fairies are the household spirits, brownies, hobgoblins, and other names that vary from shire to shire. They are famously industrious at night, sweeping the hearth, turning the dough, or bringing good luck to the household that feeds them. Yet they are not domesticated in the modern sense. They demand a certain kind of reciprocity, milk, bread, or a silent respect. The very act of acknowledging a brownie with a formal gift of clothing often offends its sense of contract. The tale repeats. A farmer or landlady wishing to reward the helpful spirit offers it a small coat or shirt. The spirit, affronted, leaves forever, never to return. The moral is awkwardly ambiguous. The human sought to express gratitude in terms they understood, but the gesture violated a taboo that has its own internal logic. Gratitude should not be translated into the language of wages. The tale warns against assuming that human economies and non-human obligations are interchangeable. Changelings form one of the more troubling clusters of belief in English folklore. The motif is familiar. A child, sickly or different, is said by neighbours to be replaced by an otherworldly substitute. The reasons for such identifications were diverse. Medical ignorance, disabilities, neurodivergence, or postpartum troubles, but the cultural response could be severe. Some families, convinced they had a fairy substitute, attempted rituals to recover their original child. Exposing the changeling to iron, placing the infant near a smithy, or performing tests thought to reveal the other nature. Tragically, in some documented instances, Preventive or expulsion rituals led to neglect, abuse, or even killing of children, believed to be the replacement. It is essential to be explicit and sober here. Folklore provided a framework for explanation in communities with little access to medical knowledge, but that framework could, and did, lead to harm. When we discuss these stories, we must not gawk at the past. We must name the suffering and seek to understand the social pressures, poverty, lack of medical care, isolation, that made such explanations feel necessary. The landscape binds these stories together. Fairy rings, those near-perfect circles of mushrooms, are perhaps the most visible sign that the natural world carries folklore. To a mycologist, the ring is a result of fungal growth. To a walker in centuries past, stepping into it risked being pulled into a dance with consequences you could not foresee. The ring marks a place where the human habit of naming and walking meets a different order. Similar reverence attaches to mounds. Do not dig where a barrow stands. Do not cut the hawthorn that shades it. These small prohibitions act as social memory, preserving places of archaeological or ritual importance through a layer of myth. In many cases, what begins as a pragmatic respect for an ancient monument becomes cloaked in narrative. The mound is the home of the fair folk. Anyone who disturbs it brings misfortune. There is nuance in all this. Helpfulness and danger mingle. A brownie that will turn your oven at night is the same class of being that will leave if given a shirt. A pixie who leads a careless walker into a bog is also the one whose pranks teach the importance of not traveling alone after dusk. The darker outcomes, disappearances, misfortune, the rigid interpretation of words, arise because these beings operate by an internal logic that does not prioritize human intentions. A promise given in a jest might be upheld with terrifying literalness. Many of the cautionary tales function as social adhesives. Obey the taboos, respect the borders, and you will be excluded from scandal or misfortune. The English corpus contains literary engagements as well as oral ones. Chaucer and other medieval writers record fairy revels and the uneasy allure of the strange companion. Shakespeare, in his turn, captures the ambiguous realm where mischief and malice are indistinguishable in the Merchant of Venice's references and in the ambiguous fairy interventions of A Midsummer Night's Dream. Puck or Robin Goodfellow, latterly a mischievous sprite, has an older, more liminal presence in folklore, the domestic trickster who can be helpful but also dangerously untrustworthy. The contrast between artistic renderings and oral practice is telling. Playwrights shape and stylize what informants in a cottage might relate around their hearth. Both preserve pieces of a fractious tradition. Victorian collectors complicated the picture. Scholars and antiquarians went into the countryside armed with notebooks and a confidence that they were rescuing fading traditions. But they did more than collect. They curated, edited, and sometimes harmonized accounts to fit contemporary tastes. The image of the dainty winged fairy is a product of this period, one that has stuck in popular imagination because it is palatable and easily commodified. Folklore collections preserved countless stories that refused to be domesticated, tales of bargains gone wrong, of spectral hosts, of women taken by lakes. But Victorian illustration and children's literature emphasized the sprite. The result is a cultural double-take. Outwardly, fairies look like domestic ornaments. In the folklore beneath, they remain wild, rule-bound, often dangerous. Within England, the social function of these beliefs deserves emphasis. Fairy lore can be a way to police behavior without centralized authority. A neighbor's cautionary tale about someone who whistled by a mound and died young is a story about the consequences of disrespect. The threats are often moralized, but they are also practical. Heed the boundaries, and the community continues. Transgress them, and social order is at risk. Folktales operate as teaching devices. Do not accept naked bargains. Do not bring the wrong gift. Do not presume to remove the markers of past generations. In a society where law might have been distant and literacy low, mythic narratives carry the weight of precedent. There are particular motifs in English tales worth underscoring because they recur across other regions. Iron is an almost universal repellent. Nails and blades, and even the presence of iron in a smithy, are thought to disturb fairies. Salt and triple offerings, gifts given 3 times, appear as ritual gestures. Speech itself is treacherous. Naming things matter-of-factly can be interpreted by non-human listeners as a binding act. The interpersonal ethics of speech, how to phrase a refusal, whether to use threefold language, are surprisingly sophisticated. The law consists of practical phonetics and pragmatic law, teaching speakers to be cautious with promises and to manage their words with care. I want to tell one English story in more detail because it encapsulates these patterns. The tale comes from a West Country tradition. A man returning at dusk takes a shortcut over a field and notices lights among the grasses. Curiosity, or perhaps the modern word would be heedlessness, draws him toward a ring of dancers. He stops to watch, and one dancer, a woman arranged as if for a marriage, beckons him. He sits and is welcomed. Time passes. When he finally stands and hurries home, he finds changes. His boots are worn in a way he does not remember. A week or more has passed, and his neighbor's child, who was ill, has recovered in his absence. The man has become entangled in a bargain that both gives and takes. The message is not that fairies are simply evil. The tale is ambivalent. There is exhilaration, there is profit, there is loss. Its caution is precise. One night with the supernatural may yield strange gifts, but it will also upend social life and obligations. Another English motif that rewards attention is the household spirit who rejects a gift of clothes. The story is often told with a combination of humor and melancholy. A family, grateful for help with chores, decides to reward the unseen worker with a new garment. The gift is intended to elevate the worker from servitude to acknowledged laborer, but for the spirit, the gift is an insult. It translates silent reciprocity into a wage, and in refusing it, by leaving forever, the creature withdraws the favors it had silently performed. The household loses a benefactor. The moral eye reads the tale two ways: as a lesson in humility about not trying to commodify kindness, and as a reminder that gratitude must respect the form and terms of the relation to which it pertains. Perhaps most fraught are the changeling narratives. Because they touch on illness and difference, they reveal the social anxieties of communities facing medical unknowns. Folklore explains, but also assigns meaning to hard circumstances. When a baby refuses to thrive or manifests behaviors that neighbors call uncanny, the community's storytelling apparatus converts the unknowable into narrative. The fairies have taken this child and substituted an other. The rituals designed to expose a changeling, putting red-hot pokers by the child's bed, holding it over a fire, or refusing to feed it, can be lethal. While some accounts record ritualized tests that eventually led to reconciliation, others record grim outcomes. The stories prompt historians and anthropologists to ask uncomfortable questions. How did poverty, stigma, and lack of health care feed into these narratives? To treat these tales purely as entertainment is to misunderstand their social function and their human cost. As the English section shows, folklore is not merely a catalogue of fantastical beings. It is a set of practices, a lexicon of preventative measures, and a moral pedagogy. The stories are also place-bound. You cannot remove a fairy mound from its setting without impoverishing the tale. A ring of mushrooms on a Lancashire common has different resonances than a hawthorn on a Devon lane or an old barrow on a Northamptonshire field. That variation is not arbitrary. Landscape shapes belief. People gave names to places: Fairy Hill, the Fairy Tree, Witch's Pond, and those names carried the weight of taboos and memory. In many cases, those names are still on maps, stubborn traces of a time when human life intersected with non-human notions of property and precedence. Before we cross the Severn into Wales, it's worth pausing for a brief pivot. The literary imagination and the oral tradition sometimes meet and sometimes diverge. Puck, Queen Mab, Oberon, and other named figures appear in plays and poems, where their ambiguity is often theatricalized. The dramatists make moral lessons and comic opportunities of fairy motifs, but the folks who lived with these stories in the hedgerows and by the hearth carried different concerns. Their tales were not stage props. They were working theories about how to live in a world that included unaccountable occurrences, sudden prosperity, unexplained bereavement, or the eerie comportment of a child. When a medieval chronicler tells of men who met a fairy host crossing the moor, he is not merely reporting a curiosity. He is documenting an event that carried social meaning for the witnesses. The English arc ends for now on the question of variability. How can similar motifs appear across counties, yet mean different things? The answer lies in the ways communities adapt narratives to local needs. A farmer in Cornwall tells a tale about pixies to warn against taking a stranger home at night. A village in Yorkshire uses a changeling story to explain infant mortality. These differences are not contradictions, but adaptations. Folklore is a living conversation with place. The rules and taboos shift, but certain constants remain. Respect thresholds, be precise in speech, do not repurpose gifts of ritual in ways that violate their logic. As I prepared this series, I kept returning to one small anecdote an elderly woman told me in a parish hall. She pointed to a hawthorn and explained matter-of-factly that they never trimmed it because it's not our tree. The phrasing is simple and unremarkable, but it carries an ethical depth. The tree belongs to a history she must honor. This modest precaution, do not cut the hawthorn, encapsulates an attitude toward the landscape that threads through the British and Irish folklore. The land keeps its memory, and human beings are only temporary tenants. It is a theme we will meet again as we move westward into Wales, where the Lake Maidens and the Unravel traditions give a different inflection to bargains and taboos. There, the stakes of marriage, healing, and the transfer of knowledge come to the fore in stories where a broken taboo breaks a household. Already, you can see the outlines of what makes fairy belief dark, in the sense I intend. These are not simple tales of malice, but systems in which human lives are susceptible to the logic of a non-human order. The danger stems less from malevolent intent than from misalignment. Humans who misname, misapply, or misinterpret a rule pay a price. The dark side is not a single moral failing, but the systemic possibility that our words and gestures can bind us in ways we do not foresee. In the next section, we will cross into Wales and listen to the Lake Marshal tales, stories of bridemaids from Llyn Fanfach and the Unravel traditions that make the bargain between human and otherworldly spouse precise, contractual, and sometimes catastrophic. For now, hold the image of the hawthorn, the fairy ring, and the household that lost a helper, because it misunderstood the economy of gratitude. These are the small human scenes in which the wider logic of fairy belief plays out, intimate, local, and quietly consequential. She left when the third blow fell. The version most commonly told of the Llyn Fanfach maiden begins like many lake wife stories. A young farmer or shepherd hears music by a remote lake, waits, and finds a woman of such otherworldly beauty that his heart is seized. She consents to a marriage, but not without conditions, rules that sound oddly contractual: do not strike her, or do not repeat some small transgression 3 times, obey an injunction about a certain place or a certain action. For a time, the household prospers. The crops swell, the stock are healthy. Sometimes the wife brings healing skills that pass to her human children. Then a human failing, sometimes impatience, sometimes anger altered by drink, sometimes a public humiliation, causes the man to break the taboo. The woman returns to the lake that same night, sometimes accompanied by the crying of a child she carries away with her, sometimes leaving healthy offspring who become great healers or poets. The household that once gained now loses. Prosperity departs, and the man is left to reflect on what he has misunderstood. What makes this tale darker than the Victorian postcard image is not merely loss, but the legalism of the otherworld. The woman is not capricious in the modern sense. She is bound by a code that interprets human gestures with merciless literalness. A slap becomes a final breach. Gratitude misapplied becomes theft. The gift of endurance in the forge of a fairy marriage can be revoked at a small infraction. In some tellings, the departing wife refuses to forgive, and the household collapses economically and emotionally. In others, a son inherits her healing art and becomes a bridge between the two worlds, a living testament that such bargains exact a price even as they reward. These Welsh tales, Llyn Fanfach among the most famous, are steeped in a cultural language that treats places as morally animate. Unravel, or the otherworld, is not merely a scenic underlay, but a lived imaginative geography. Lakes, barrows, hilltops, and fairy mounds mark thresholds where human jurisdiction thins. Poets, in particular, engaged this liminality. In medieval Welsh tradition, the bard acted as mediator. Poetic composition could approach the sacred, and song itself was a technology of crossing. The Lake Maiden stories, therefore, are less about the individual woman and more about how communities negotiated marriage, inheritance, and skill transfer in an environment saturated with pre-Christian memory. The bargain is an ethic and a legal fiction, used to explain why certain families keep a talisman, why certain lineages are reputed to heal, and why a village might avoid taking a shortcut across a particular moor. Wales preserves other motifs with similar force. The Tylwyth Teg, the fair folk, are described as beautiful but remote, at once alluring and governed by rules that do not accommodate human fuzzy thinking. Time dilation, threefold taboos, the necessity of precise speech. These reappear in variant forms across Welsh oral landscapes. A shepherd who accepts a cup of drink from one of them may find he has been gone for decades when he returns. A poet who utters a promise in jest may discover the vow is binding. The moral texture here is not moralizing in a straightforward way. Instead, it cultivates an ethic of attention, an injunction to learn the grammar of the non-human world that surrounds a community. Travelling from Wales into Ireland, the scale of the fairy tradition swells. Here the Irish imagination gives fairies a long genealogical backstory. The medieval cycle of myth places beings like the Tuatha De Danann at the centre of a pre-Christian divine order. Later tradition folded these powerful figures into the subterranean society of the Eos Sea, folk of the mounds, who are at once former deities and current residents of barrows and fairy forts. The rough story is familiar. A people who were once godlike retire into earthworks at the coming of a new social order, and the living thereafter live alongside their presence rather than on top of it. From that cosmological depth emerges a rich catalogue of beings. The Banshee or Beansea, associated not with malice, but with family-specific mourning. The Pooka, a shape-shifting trickster who can be both benefactor and scourge. The Leprechaun, whose shoe-mending and hoarding of coins mask an older, more complicated figure of solitary craft. Selkies and seal folk on the coasts, and changelings who, like their English cousins, become shorthand for difference and illness. Irish practice displays a particularly vivid caution. Do not anger the fort. Do not cut down the fairy tree. Move your road if a fort stands in the way of a new turnpike. These practices read like a cultural zoning law enacted by centuries of oral transmission. The Banshee deserves special attention because she sits at the intersection of beauty, omen, and family. Contrary to the sensational image of a wailing female ghost who simply foreshadows death for any passerby, the Beansea, in many accounts, is attached to lineage. Her songs or keening signal impending death in particular households. Her mournful alert is a social, not random communication. That family specificity makes the phenomenon less like a general curse and more like a narrative mechanism by which communities model how grief and fate are socially anchored. The lament itself, as recorded by collectors, is often described with a deferential mixture of fear and pity. Her music is terrible, precisely because it announces loss, not because she is malicious. The Pooka, or Pooka in many anglicized spellings, is ambivalent in a different register. In tales it might appear as a black horse with a glossy, sea-wet mane, capably carrying a rider into strange terrain before leaving them stranded. Or it might be a goat or dog that steals the farm's best oats. Like so many in this tradition, the Pooka's mischief often has a social pedagogical function. The farmer warned not to overreach, the youth admonished against late-night wandering. On the other hand, some stories cast the Pooka as an agent of subtle generosity, leading a lost child to the edge of a road or evading a worse fate. The lesson is caution, without simple moral binaries. Irish cautionary customs are often extraordinarily concrete. Folklore recorders collected accounts of villagers who would alter infrastructure to accommodate the presence of a fairy site. Roads were rerouted, wells were left undisturbed, and hawthorns were left standing despite their inconvenient growth. These actions are not mere superstition when seen in aggregate. They are conservation measures dressed in a narrative economy. In many instances, the preservation of a barrow, a tree, or a spring had the practical effect of protecting archaeology and biodiversity, though of course the original motive resided in a relationship to the non-human agencies enshrined by tradition. If one theme recurs across Ireland, it is the blending of political and mythic memory. The Tuatha De Danann, whether historicized or mythologized, carry the imprint of cultural loss. The fairy mound is both a literal mound and a locus of ancestral grievance, a reminder that another world once held sway. That memory is expressed not only in narrative, but in ritualized avoidance. The social effect is clear. By treating certain locales as sacrosanct, communities maintained an ethics of care toward the landscape, an ethic born of mythic thinking that nevertheless produced very real, long-lasting consequences in land use. Changelings in Ireland often sit in this charged context of poverty, medical ignorance and family stress. As in England, where misattributed ailments sometimes provoked cruel attempts at expulsion, the Irish responses could range from benign testings to violent interventions. The methodological caution is to remember context. In pre-modern and early modern settings, a community's ability to interpret illness was primitive and often infused with moral meanings. Folk tales make those meanings explicit, but they also encode the social logic that could result in real harm. As we tell these stories, we must keep the victims, children, caregivers, those in social isolation, clearly in view, and recall that narratives that explain misfortune often arise in the absence of other kinds of institutional support. From Ireland to Scotland, the mood darkens again in distinct ways. Scottish law preserves the dichotomy of Seelie and unseelie courts. The Seelie court comprised fair folk who might be kindly by human standards, though still dangerous, while the unseelie court is more openly hostile, given to ambush, theft, and other direct harms. That division helps listeners understand why some fairy encounters are merely inconvenient and others become life-threatening. It also frames the way communities deployed countermeasures: salt and iron, spoken charm and avoidance, the careful performance of ritual where necessary. The Kelpie, a water spirit usually associated with lochs and rivers, is perhaps the most emblematic of Scotland's watery terrors. Descriptions vary, but in its classic form the Kelpie appears as a horse of impossible beauty by the water's edge, mane glistening, inviting the unwary to mount. A rider will find the animal impossible to control. The Kelpie will plunge into the depths, and the human passenger will be drowned. In some stories, the Kelpie can take human shape and will entice or force lovers to the water. The origin of the Kelpie motif, like other water spirit myths, likely functions as a maritime safety tale transformed into moral and metaphysical language. Do not trust the beauty by the shore. The water hides a different logic. Selkies, in which a seal person sheds its skin to become human on land, bring a different kind of tragedy. A man who finds and hides a Selkie's skin forces a marriage that produces children, but inevitably the Selkie will discover the skin and return to the sea, sometimes taking the children with her, or leaving them behind with a mournful blessing. The human partner is rarely comforted. These stories, often told by women of the coasts, address the brutal fact that many island households historically endured male absences, losses at sea, and the precariousness of survival. The Selkie tale verbalizes a profound ambivalence about belonging. The one who appears as spouse may not, by any settled standard, be fully of the human order. That ambiguous kinship produces heartbreak rather than villainy. There are darker, bloodier threads in Scottish lore too. The Bowbun Sith, anglicized as Banshee in some cross-cultural retellings but distinct in origin, is often described as an alluring woman who dances at fairs and then drinks the life of men she encounters, leaving behind a drained corpse. The figure sits at the junction of seduction and predation in the imagination, a combative inversion of romantic desire that becomes lethal. As with Kelpies and Selkies, these motifs perform a warning function. Desire, beauty, or curious intimacy can carry fatal consequences when one misreads the social terms that govern non-human beings. Across these regions, the wild hunt or fairy host motif recurs, the thunderous movement of riders across moors, the beat of phantom hooves, the terrifying sight of a host sweeping past on some cursed night. Witnesses to such hosts might relate waking to find a neighbor's livestock missing or a house touched by misfortune. These processions, which sometimes carry off unfortunate souls, emphasize scale. Fair folk can be tiny household helpers and also vast organized powers capable of mass movement. The host transforms the landscape into theater and asserts a claim to mobility that mirrors and mocks human military parades, a reminder that non-human law can rival human law in force. When we compare these regional tableaux, patterns emerge that deepen our interpretive frame. First, bargains and the literalism of language recur everywhere. Whether you are in a Cornish lane beside a Welsh lake, on an Irish coombe or near a Scottish loch, the cautionary provision is similar. Words once spoken may be binding in ways strangers' intentions do not anticipate. Second, time plays tricks in each tradition. A night in fairy company equals years for those left behind, or families exchange rhythms in ways that problematize ordinary calendars. Third, we repeatedly see taboo objects: iron, salt, a blade, threefold actions that act as material buffers between orders. These things are not arbitrary. Iron, for instance, is frequently associated with technology and human control. Its appearance in folklore as a repellent suggests a folk intuition about the material boundaries between human manufacture and the otherwise. All of this has social utility. Fairy belief enforces local prerogatives and rituals where centralized institutions are absent. A taboo about trimming a hawthorn becomes a rule that preserves a barrow. A story about a kelpie keeps children away from dangerous shallows. A changeling narrative stitches a social explanation around the laxer knowledge of medicine. In effect, these tales are a pre-modern infrastructure of regulation, moral, practical, and mnemonic. They scaffold community memory into actionable behaviors, but the very functional quality of these beliefs has a cost. When a society lacks the means to care for fragile children, when chronic illness is inexplicable, when poverty compresses options to the brink, narrative frameworks like changeling law become tools of both consolation and repression. Rituals meant to restore a wronged family can become instruments of violence. The historical records are unambiguous here. Some families, desperate and convinced a child was not theirs, performed tests or rituals that ended in injury or death. These are not stories to be told for shivers alone. They demand our sober attention. Folklore intervenes in lives, sometimes saving, sometimes destroying. The Victorian reframing, artists painting winged petites on teacup saucers, was not simply an aesthetic shift. It was also a social change. As daily life urbanized and literacy rose, beliefs once embedded in land use and livelihood were detached from their operational contexts. The tiny fairy is a domesticated emblem, fit for parlors and novels, but it is also a cover that softens the edges of a much harsher history. When we grow up thinking only of Tinkerbell, we lose sight of the bargaining logic of a fairy spouse, the legalism that could deprive a household of its wealth, the interpretive systems that could mark a child as other and condemn them to suffering. Yet nuance must be preserved. The dark side in these traditions is not a moral label to be stuck across every aspect of fairy belief. Many tales speak of help and alliance, of healers inheriting remedies from otherworldly spouses, of household spirits that sustain the nightwork of countless families. The darkness appears when human and non-human economies collide, when human intention and non-human obligation fail to commensurate. It is, in part, an ethics of misalignment. The fairy does not delight in harm for its own sake. It enacts a separate logic that may collide fatally with human expectation. There is also a cultural memory embedded in place names and practices that deserves appreciation. When a community refuses to plough a barrow, refrains from trimming a hawthorn, or tells its children a story about a ring of mushrooms, it is transmitting knowledge across generations. Such knowledge can be protective. In some regions, these prohibitions preserved archaeological features, rare habitats, or dangerous spots in the landscape. To dismiss them as mere superstitions is to lose sight of how oral tradition functioned as a repository of practical environmental knowledge, a vernacular ecology mediated by the language of the uncanny. Which brings us back finally to a question of attitude. How should modern listeners approach these tales? Curiosity is a fine entry point, but it must be paired with caution and humility. These narratives are not museum pieces, but living documents of how communities negotiated risk, grief, and belonging. Aesthetic delight in the strangeness of a pond wife or a selkie should not displace recognition of the suffering that sometimes accompanied belief. Neither should a cautious academic tone strip the stories of their emotional charge. The trick is to hold both imagination and empathy together, to savor the eerie brilliance of a Kelpie's mane, while also naming the drownings that may have inspired the tale, to admire the economy of a threefold taboo, while acknowledging the families who suffered when social institutions failed them. There is a final layer worth lifting, the present-day afterlives of these beliefs. In contemporary Britain and Ireland, fairy stories persist in place names, in writers' imaginations, in the margins of legal cases about land use, and in the popular tourist economy. The Hawthorn remains a meeting place in some villages. The mound still stands in others. The story of the Lake Maiden is told in visitor centres and local festivals. At the same time, the commercialisation of the tiny fairy, Tinkerbell on pennants and tea towels, has a flattening effect. It helps to commodify and domesticate the non-human, making it safe to sell. That safe image is not neutral. It reframes the complex moral world of bargains and taboos into a marketable cuteness that obscures the historical depth beneath. Yet the deeper tales are not buried altogether. Folk revivalists, local historians, and community storytellers keep the older motifs alive. In rural parish halls, an older woman may still point to a hawthorn and say, in a half-joke, half-serious voice, "We don't cut that tree, it's not ours." That simple line articulates an ethic that modern planners and archaeologists often wish to recreate. Treat the landscape as heirloom, not merely as resource. It is a tiny act of stewardship, carried through myth rather than statute. So what does unveiling the dark side finally amount to? It is not moral sensationalism. It is an opening of historical eyes, to see that fairies, as the peoples of Britain and Ireland imagined them, inhabit a world of reciprocal obligations and alien grammars. They reward in ways that bind, they beautify in ways that seduce, and they punish in ways that make human missteps catastrophic. Their darkness is systemic rather than demonic, an echo of the consequences that arise when humans misread a world populated by other logics. As a scholar storyteller, I am also interested in what these traditions ask of us today. They ask for respect for place, for memory, for those whose suffering was narrated into existence by communities with few other resources. They ask also for attentiveness to the boundaries we draw, and to the ways we narrativize difference. Modernity can learn from the old cautionary scripts, not to reify them, certainly, but to recognize that every cultural narrative carries practical implications. When a village preserved a hawthorn because a story told it to, they were practicing an ethic of caretaking embedded in myth. Before I close, consider one more image, a mother in a small Irish hamlet who leans on old stories not out of superstition, but out of an accumulated sense of what her landscape requires. The stories are both poetry and policy. Those tales do not simply frighten children into obedience. They articulate a form of governance without bureaucrats, distributed across generations. They are not perfect, and they sometimes hurt. The record of changeling-related tragedies forces us to reckon with the costs, but the living law that remains in place names and hedgerows also contains strategies of conservation, community memory, and ethical attention that we would do well to study. If you grew up with a tale about a fairy tree, a lake maiden, or a ring of mushrooms, I invite you to share it. Tell us where you heard it and how it shaped the way you walked the land. These local memories are the living threads that keep folklore meaningful. For now, let me end where I began. The modern sprite and the courtly fae are not the same thing. The first offers an image of charm and domestic pleasure. The second offers an ethical universe in which human lives are constantly negotiated, interpreted, and sometimes undone. Unveiling the dark side of fairies is not an exercise in fear-mongering. It is an attempt to see the full range of how people once, and sometimes still, make sense of danger, grief, and reciprocity. The stories teach a wary hospitality. Be curious, but mind the terms of the house you enter. Be generous, but learn the grammar of gratitude. And above all, listen to the place names and the old women in the parish hall who still know which trees are not theirs to prune. If this exploration has stirred you, subscribe to follow more regional deep dives into British and Irish folklore. And if you have a local legend you think I should investigate next, share it in the comments or send a note. These stories live by being told carefully and respectfully from one listener to another. Thank you for keeping your attention with me across the mounds, the hedgerows, the lochs, and the long-shadowed thresholds, where the fair folk once, and perhaps still, keep their own rules.